Hey everyone, I'm Ernesto Falcon. I'm the Senior Legislative Counsel at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and welcome to today's EFF30 Fireside Chat. This is our conversation series commemorating 30 years of EFF fighting for user freedom. Thank you very much for joining us. A couple things for reminders. We are saving the final part of today's program for you. Drop your questions into the chat at any time at twitch.tv/EFF live. We'll pick them up and respond to as many as we can towards the end of the hour. And also note that EFF has a code of conduct for our public events, so please be kind. You can check that out at EFF.org/event-expectations. So this series is a live discussion that looks back at some of the biggest battles of internet history and how they're shaping our digital future. Today, we're taking a closer look at the movement around creating an open web, and also discuss how digital access, or the lack of access, are affecting many of our communities across the country and around the world. Joining me today are two special guests. First guest is the EFF Associate Director of Policy and Activism, Katharine Trendacosta. After getting her JD at USC Gold School of Law, and following many years as a writer and editor at the science fiction and science website IO9, Katharine joined EFF's activism team to focus on intellectual property, net neutrality, fair use, free speech online, and intermediate liability issues. A very wide portfolio and lots of very important issues to the internet. Next, I'm pleased to welcome net neutrality pioneer Gigi Sohn. She is one of the nation's leading public interest advocates for an open, affordable, and democratic communications network. Gigi is a distinguished fellow at the Georgetown Law Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy, a Benton Senior Fellow and Public Advocate, and a member of the EFF's Board of Directors. She was counselor to the former chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, Tom Wheeler, who gave us the 2015 Open Internet Order that many EFF membership are huge fans of. And she has served as the co-founder and CEO of Public Knowledge, a leading telecommunications, media, and technology policy advocacy organization, where I came across her as a former Hill staffer and joined the nonprofit sector there many years ago. She is also a project specialist at the Ford Foundation's Media Arts and Culture Unit, and executive director of the Media Access Project, a public interest law firm. So thank you both for joining us. Now, to kick off the conversation here, a common philosophy that I explain to folks in my work, and I do a lot of work in the policy space about why EFF cares about a certain issue, is as the internet and technology evolves, we have always adopted the idea that our rights should remain the same or expand. At its founding 30 years ago, EFF was established at the early days of the internet, when a lot of the legal questions about the privacy of your computer files, your freedom to express yourself on the internet, and how the digital world interacts with your civil liberties, these were just unknown. We were unsettled on the questions and answers here. And EFF, as a law firm, litigated many of the major cases that address these questions. But now, you look to today, if you look back then, there was no legal field that focused on these issues, whereas today, practically every lawyer job involves some aspect of the internet. And now there are dozens of nonprofits that we collectively call civil society, including EFF, that tackle a whole range of consumer issues. So given that we have Gigi here with us today, who really is one of the founding members of the public interest community decades ago, I would love you, Gigi, to take us back to like the early days of consumer advocacy before we had EFF as robust as it is nowadays, though we are still tiny compared to who we can fight between the government and the companies. Because I think people would be surprised to learn just how much the fights were back then for internet freedom and how much they were reflected with the fights of today. So Gigi, take us back to specifically, the work that you went into to find Public Knowledge, and what was going on in Congress in those days, and what was the public debate of the internet back then.
Sure, and just let me thank EFF for having me here today, and I am a very, very proud EFF board member, and want to thank all the supporters out in the audience. So just to give you a little preface, before I was at Public Knowledge, I was at an organization, Ernie, you mentioned, Media Access Project, where I was fighting, frankly, hopelessly, to try to get broadcasters and cablecasters to abide by their public interest duties, which they actually have under the law. This was really pre-commercial internet. The internet was, an experiment that was going on in government and in research universities, but obviously was not a commercial thing. And the top-down command and control media at the time just really gave no space for any kind of user control, any kind of discussion, democratic discussion of issues. There was a policy called the Fairness Doctrine, which I won't get into. But again, it was always trying to force the gatekeepers to do the right thing. So after I went to the Ford Foundation, I was asked to start Public Knowledge, largely because, well, first of all, the internet was a thing then. So this was 2001, and there's very little policy around it. But what was happening was that the copyright industries, so Hollywood, the recording industry, the book publishers, saw this technology that gave people power to control their own experience and what they wanted to see and what they wanted to listen to, and it flipped them out. So I was asked to form Public Knowledge more in reaction to what had been going on in the years in the years prior. So in other words, the passage of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. I probably don't have to explain what that is to this audience.
The EFF membership are very familiar with that and very familiar with the problems that involve that law.
And then the 20-year extension of copyright law. So I was approached by a bunch of academics, including Larry Lessig, Pam Samuelson, another EFF board member, Julie Cohen, Yochai Benkler, to say, look, the public interest community just got, such as it was, and it wasn't much, right? It was really the libraries did the best they could with limited resources to push back against the DMCA and the extension of copyright, and they failed. We really need an organization in Washington that's dedicated to a free and open internet, free of copyright gatekeepers and free of ISP gatekeepers. So, it was always about the commons and having a space where people could create, people could innovate, people could have democratic discourse. So that the copyright work, and then eventually became patent and trademark work as well, and the internet work. The open internet work went hand in hand.
So on the aspect of ISP gatekeepers, which we often bring into when we talk about issues of net neutrality, how has the issue of net neutrality, in your opinion, evolved? Because often I think, particularly when it comes to media coverage, and as I mentioned, the 2015 Open Internet Order, some people think that's when it all started, and it actually goes back way further than that. And I'd love to get your perspective from kind of the early days of what was net neutrality, as debate, and and how you think the movement has grown and changed over the years.
Sure. So, you're right. To those whose interest it serves, they treat net neutrality as a very recent issue. But in fact, it actually started in the late 1990s. And before I go through that history, I think it's really important to say that the issue of net neutrality, right, which we know as we don't want the ISPs blocking, throttling, engaging in pay prioritization, or otherwise determining who wins and loses on the internet, right? That's the understanding of the principle of net neutrality. But it's always been tied up in the issue of who will regulate the on-ramps to the internet. Not the internet itself, but those companies that provide, internet access. So I think it's really, really important to understand that this is a drum I've been beating for 20 years, right? It's not about blocking, not about throttling. I mean, it is, but the real issue is, are we going to have this, highly concentrated, some would say monopolistic industry without any government oversight? So everything really started in the late 90s when the city of Portland's cable consumer protection agency said to AT&T, which was a cable company at the time. Okay, AT&T has gone through a lot of different iterations. Said your cable modem service, right, which was DSL was the first broadband, but it was super slow. but cable modem service was something different. Your cable modem service is a cable service, and we're going to regulate it like a cable service under Title VI of the Communications Act. Well, needless to say, AT&T went nuts. They appealed it to the Ninth Circuit. The Ninth Circuit said, no, it's not a cable service. It's a telecommunications service under Title II of the Communications Act of 1934, and therefore needs to be regulated like a telephone service, essentially. Okay, so that was the first. And by the way, the FCC at the time, which was Democratic run, they would not get involved. And it's funny. I used to talk to this guy, the guy who, I forget his name, who was the head of the cable office in Portland at the time and brought this whole case. He begged the FCC to get involved and put his finger on the scale and said, yes, this is either a cable service or telecommunications service. They refused.
Right. Call the ball or strike. Yeah.
Right. The Ninth Circuit decision comes out. The administration changes and the FCC gets its opportunity under a Republican administration. And the question gets raised again. What is this cable modem service, right? DSL, they didn't include it. And the FCC said, it's an information service. It's an unregulated information service. And that really got the ball rolling and this was 2002. Now, prior to 2002, there was a very robust competitive dial-up internet market. The average American had a choice of 13 dial-up ISPs, and prices were very, very low. I remember this, Ernie, maybe you don't, Katharine, maybe you don't, but it was a time of incredibly robust competition because the Telecommunications Act of 1996 required dominant telecommunications providers to open up their networks to competitors. Well, once the FCC ruled that cable modem service and then DSL and then wireless broadband was no longer a telecommunications service, but in fact was unregulated, the competitive industry dried up. Okay, I'm leaving out a very important part. That 2002 decision went all the way to the Supreme Court in a case called Brand X. And the Supreme Court said, you know what, that's not really calling cable modem service an information service is not the best reading of the Communications Act, but it's not arbitrary and capricious, so we'll let it go. The biggest dissenter, Antonin Scalia.
Right.
That was 2005. Then
a liberal judge.
A real liberal justice. Right, a liberal, but a guy actually had a lot of background in telecommunications issues and media issues. So anyway, I will go on, and I don't want to go on and on and on, just to say that after that decision came down in 2005, the FCC decided to apply the same reasoning to DSL, apply the same reasoning to wireless data, and the competitive industries, as I said before, completely dried up. And that's where you found yourself with this incredible consolidation, and edge providers, who at the time were people like Disney and AOL and Microsoft, start to freak out and wanted something which at the time was called open access. And then after Tim Wu came along and named it, it was called net neutrality. So those were the early days, but it started in Portland, then was accelerated by the deregulation of the FCC.
No, it's always a fascinating step of history, and I think I'm not too old, but not too young, but I do remember, having some choice when it comes down to access. And, I fast forward to today, I've got one option. That's all. I don't even have two. People, talk about competition in this market, and it's vanished. It's disappeared. But, Katharine, I thought folks told me that when net neutrality was going to be repealed, all sorts of good things were supposed to happen from that, right? What actually happened, in the years that followed the Restoring Internet Freedom Order, which is the order that repealed net neutrality?
Yeah, because it was net neutrality that was holding the companies back from making good service. And I think we've all seen, as we've spent the last year relying so heavily on our internet access, that it's been great. It's worked exactly as it was supposed to. Yeah, so it's actually kind of interesting because both sides of this debate kind of accuse the other one of saying either it's going to be great or the sky is falling, whereas what's actually happened is more complicated. That is that nothing got better. If anything, things got slightly worse in the sense that companies were able to charge you more, or in the case of things like HBO Max, AT&T was able to zero rate it and preference its own content over the content of others because there wasn't net neutrality protections anymore. At the same time, because there was this limbo, because there was the Mozilla v. FCC case challenging the net neutrality repeal, and because California passed its own strong net neutrality protection in SB 822, everyone was kind of waiting to see exactly what would shake out before those companies went and like raided everything in the cabinets and ran off like the Hamburglar. So, and all the deals that would have to be in place to do those quicker things, either you didn't see them, or a lot of those companies already have deals with those ISPs. The largest companies have those deals with the ISPs so that they can continue to work. What gets punished is your smaller competitors. And what we know didn't happen is none of the so-called money those companies saved went into building anything. No one's investment in building better infrastructure went up. What happened with their massive tax cut and net neutrality is that they did stock buybacks, which is when companies buy their own stock to make them look good for their investors. So what ended up happening was basically nothing. It didn't get better. It was never about customers getting a better deal, and we're never going to get that. Net neutrality, I always put it like, in an ideal world, you have net neutrality protections and you have competition, right? You have net neutrality protection so that no one can discriminate, and you have options so that you can pick the system that works best for you or the company that has ideals you want to support. In the world right now, we have neither. And that's a bad place to be, because most Americans can't choose an ISP. So it's not like you can go pick an ISP that has a net neutrality commitment in their terms and conditions, because your choices are usually one of the major companies. I always say, I live in San Francisco now. This is the first time in my life I've had a choice in my ISP. First time ever. Before, it was always just like you would move into your building, and when you moved in, they'd be like, and here are your options. It is one company. Please enjoy Comcast or AT&T.
I mean, it's a funny dynamic with San Francisco in particular, and parts of San Francisco being, I sit here on the East Bay as an EFF staffer for the exact same, work at the same building as when we used to be in buildings, right? And I have a monopoly choice. Yeah, I have a monopoly choice, and I pay 3 times as much for less than my coworkers who live closer into San Francisco and have choices between Sonic, Comcast, AT&T, and Monkey Brains. And Monkey Brains is a WISP, but also does some fiber. Sonic is a creature of the 96 Act that Gigi talked about a competitive company that was created from an act of Congress, run by a gentleman by the name of Dane Jasper, who has a phenomenal story of when the internet and the network was more open under Title II, under 96 law. As a college kid, he started his internet company, his internet service provider company, and then eventually from a dial-up company became a DSL company to what it is today, which is I think the largest competitive fiber entity in the country, which is right here in EFF's backyard. So it is one of those things where our advocacy in the infrastructure space, and Katharine, I want to follow up with you on this. A handful of years ago, EFF concluded that the lack of fiber infrastructure and fiber connectivity is a serious problem, because when people needed more access and higher speeds, you started losing choice. And if we look at internet access as what's like the slow, mediocre speed, we have lots of those, so there must be competition. That's just not true. And the pandemic, I think, has eviscerated that argument wholesale. But Katharine, today, Congress is debating infrastructure. What do you see today as being the contours of the debate, and what are the, where do you think things stand now? And walk us through what you think happens next year.
Yeah, I think I also want to apologize for my cat. She learned during quarantine that if I'm talking in the direction of my computer, she gets a lot of attention if she wanders in front of the computer. So she does it constantly. So I would say what's fascinating to me about this debate about net neutrality and broadband access is that it's like, for the people who live their lives, it's not a partisan issue.
Right.
Most Americans support net neutrality. Most Americans need internet access. And in fact, it's rural Americans and it's Americans in places you would think of as red states who desperately need better access, who need the infrastructure. And it's places like Chattanooga, Tennessee, that built their own fiber infrastructure. So it doesn't follow any of those partisan lines, but the nature of DC is that everything gets turned into something like that, which is really a problem because it's not a partisan issue. Most Americans, as I said, most Americans support net neutrality, and most Americans need to get online and want to get online, and most Americans hate their ISP. Like, I don't know many people who are just like ride or die for Sprint or AT&T or Comcast. Like, that's not how it works. So I think that that's sort of the unfortunate thing, is that the debate gets really removed from the on-the-ground reality that the future is in high-speed internet access. It's what we need. The pandemic accelerated it in terms of showing us that, but we were always headed there. This isn't a blip. This is sort of what the future was going to look like. And proved that it wasn't that low-speed internet or mobile or any of the things that can't handle high capacity isn't really access. And that is an equity problem, that kids whose parents could get them online were able to have a more normal school year than kids whose parents couldn't. And people who lived places where they could get online with a good connection were able to get jobs and keep jobs that other people couldn't. Like, it is a pretty severe problem. Also, medical access. It used to be that telehealth was like a necessity only in really rural areas, or it was talked about only as a like last resort for if there wasn't a hospital nearby. But it's becoming increasingly clear that it's just how people are going to be doing things in the future. I've had many telehealth appointments in San Francisco, and I live close to UCSF. I could walk to a hospital if I needed to, but most of them were doing telehealth for routine stuff because of the pandemic. So none of the things that used to be on the edges are on the edges anymore. So it comes down to, do we want to spend the money? And then who do we want to give the money to? And I think that's a pretty big debate, which is to say that the major ISPs would say, give the money to us. We already provide internet service. We'll just keep doing that. When time has shown, when they said they would do that because they would get money without net neutrality, that they don't do it. Because they're a monopoly, because they are in many places monopolies. There's no incentive for them to do that. And so I think that's sort of the biggest sort of debating point is, should we do it? Which is yes. And who should we give the money to? And the answer is not the major incumbent ISPs.
No, that's exactly right. And I think, we've found in our own work is local public and local private options, kind of a community localism of broadband is where it's at. And we rely on these national players to do all the things that they just don't want to. And at some point, there's enough carrots handed off to the same player. We can't expect a different result. Just as a reminder, towards the end of this program, we're going to take some questions in the chat. If you have any questions, you can drop them at twitch.tv/EFF live, and we'll respond to them towards the end of the hour. But going back to this conversation about the fight over competition, it's been happening for many, many years in DC, long before we ever got to this infrastructure debate. And I think we've seen a lot of the mistakes of the past catching up to us today, particularly when it comes to mergers. The telecom market used to be thousands of companies. Now it's like, very, very few. So I have a real specific question for you, Gigi. What's going on in this picture right here?
What's going on in that picture is a really bad haircut. So that was 2011, and I was testifying against the proposed merger of AT&T and T-Mobile. And Public Knowledge's communications director at the time just happened to have one of these old, this is like a first or second generation wireless phone. So at the time, AT&T was the second largest wireless carrier. T-Mobile was the fourth. And they planned to merge. And what I was pointing out there was at the birth of the wireless industry, when those phones were, the top, there were 7 companies. And so we'd already consolidated quite a bit, and that this consolidation would further drive up prices and further give consumers less choice. So, yeah, I mean, look, it's no secret I was a major opponent of the Sprint T-Mobile merger for the same reason. I'm hoping against all hope that the Dish Network will actually be a competitor one day. It's working towards it, and I will fight to ensure that it does become a fourth competitor, because I think 4 is the minimum number of wireless providers we need. But, it's happened, unfortunately, both under, Democratic and Republican administrations, just the enormous consolidation. I think it's the Institute for Local Self-Reliance has found that something like 80 million Americans operate under a cable monopoly for their broadband. And another 40 or so have DSL as their competitive choice. And I put that in air quotes because it's a little too slow to be, to be competitive. So, look, and this gets back to how I opened up this talk, talking about authority. Restoring Fcc authority over broadband allows it to promote competition, to protect consumers from fraudulent billing and other billing issues. Allows them to close the digital divide. Right now, the FCC is doing it on a wing and a prayer, really. And if somebody really wanted to challenge their payment of subsidies for poor people, it's a program called Lifeline, or their payment to rural broadband providers to provide broadband service. That's called the High Cost Fund. It has a bunch of other names I won't repeat. They might win in court because the FCC is really not supposed to. It's supposed to be giving that money to telecommunications services, which broadband providers are not. It also calls into question, whether public safety can operate safely. Katharine talked a little bit about, what's happened in the interregnum since the FCC repealed net neutrality and, said that the FCC no longer had authority over broadband. But one of the things that happened, and this is close to home for you guys, is that the Santa Clara County Fire Department was getting its broadband throttled, and this is the system by which they not only talk to other public safety providers, but also to the public during the Mendocino complex fire. And, net neutrality doubters have said, well, that wasn't a net neutrality issue. They just didn't pay enough to get the broadband that they deserved. And I said, that may be the case, but the fire department had nowhere to go. It couldn't go to the FCC to complain about this. It couldn't go to the Federal Trade Commission to complain. It was funny because neither the FCC nor the FTC, when this was become such a big issue, it was carried on all the network stations, right? None of them came out with a statement saying, if they'd only come to us, we could have done something about it. So again, when we talk about net neutrality, we always have to think about, the authority question, because I think that's really what the ISPs fear, is they don't want that regulatory oversight. And right now, they're unregulated. And that's why, the former FCC chairman had to essentially beg the companies not to cut off people's service during the pandemic and not to, impose data caps on them. The FCC couldn't say, you must. The FCC had to say, mother may I, which the ISPs did do to their credit for 3 months. And then they stopped doing it.
Yep. Can I ask a question, Ernesto?
Go for it, Katharine.
I was thinking about this. How much, Judy, do you think, because I've been wondering, part of this has been in Congress and other places. The idea that this is also complicated. We don't know what a fiber optic cable is or what an internet is, and these companies are telling us that this is the right thing to do. So I guess they're right. How much of that is this idea that it's, technology is hard to understand, and so whatever these quote unquote experts hired by these cable companies tell us must be the way forward?
I think that's a small part of it, but not insignificant. And that's why one of the things I've advocated for, and this is another bipartisan issue, frankly, is more technical expertise on Capitol Hill.
Yep.
So there used to be something called the Office of Technology Assessment that one Antonin Scalia used to work for in the, I believe it was in the 70s, that would give technical advice to members of Congress and their staffs on these issues. Now, there is a sort of a burgeoning movement to get more technologists into those offices. There's a group called Tech Congress that places technologists in congressional offices and in offices in regulatory agencies. The Ford Foundation has led this public interest technology initiative, trying to get, again, more technologists interested in policy generally. So that's a very, very good movement. And we can't get it soon enough. Look, I think part of it is just about power. The ISPs have been, been regulated entities for, in some of them, 100 years. So they have lobbyists. Not only have lobbyists and consultants, one for every office on Capitol Hill, and Ernie knows this better than anybody else because he was there. But also the states, right? And one of the things we didn't talk about was sort of the states as a battleground for getting broadband to everybody, and for net neutrality, and for privacy. You guys know this. You've done amazing work in California. The broadband companies, they hate when the states do what they've been doing in California, and they say, well, we can't have a patchwork of laws, blah 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 blah. Well, the fact of the matter is the Communications Act contemplates both a federal and a state role in communications and regulating communications. And that's why every time the ISPs have gone to the courts to say, no, the fact that the federal government has no net neutrality regulation or no privacy regulation preempts state laws on net neutrality and privacy, the courts, even those conservative Trump-appointed judges, are like, it doesn't work that way. So another battleground that I think is really important. That's why the work you're doing in California is so important.
Similarly, when Chattanooga, Tennessee built its own fiber network, the ISPs lobbied other states to pass form legislation that they wrote to make that difficult or illegal in other states because they didn't want that kind of competition.
And they were very successful.
Yeah, I think it's something like 22 to 23 states have some sort of imposition.
It's a lot. And what's wild about it now, you think about the massive disconnect in the legislatures with the public. We're a membership organization. We talk to people all the time. I saw this Consumer Reports study that showed, I think 3/4 of Americans now think broadband is the same as electricity and water in terms of its importance in everyday life. And the idea that you would have an unregulated monopoly selling you water, right? Like, who wants that? No one wants that. That's insane.
We also, sorry, I would just say, in California, we deregulated our power industry, and the places that deregulated, by which the places that didn't have municipal water and power, I lived in LA, we had power. Northern California did not because it had deregulated. And similarly, Texas set up its power grid to avoid regulation. And
it worked out over there, right? No.
Yeah, it worked out great. It had a great year. It's been fine. I think it's things that are necessities. We have concrete proof that deregulation does not work.
Yeah, and even EFF, given this is our 30-year anniversary, there was a long road for EFF where we didn't actually support the government to be involved in this. But the realities was, because we just had this, we try to promote competition right up to the bitter end, and then it became to a point where like you lack choice. Too many mergers were allowed to go through, and you can no longer discipline a company that doesn't fear consumers leaving them. We run into that in other areas too, and particularly in the technology sector. When people talk about big tech, there was a different world of technology companies who used to be very active in this space, and then they got really big, and then they kind of became the best friends of some of the bigger players in the market. And so we always have to be vigilant of that. So I want to wrap up just on this and give people time for the questions that have come in, but just a broad question for both Katharine and Gigi, and we'll start with Katharine and then Gigi to wrap us up. But what should the future look like then? What is a better world, and what is your opinion of how we get there?
I think a world in which we have fiber infrastructure, and any company that wants to get on that infrastructure can get on that infrastructure and sell its service, and you get to choose from a list of options. Maybe something has just a policy you like, or they have some offering you like and you pay them more or less, but that the speeds that we are paying for, the speeds we are getting, rather than the current situation where Americans pay more for worse service than many other countries. I would take parity in that realm at the very least, and we get there, quite honestly, at this point, the same way we got roads and freeways and all of those things, and that's a major investment from the government. I can't really think of a way at this point. We're so far along in this problem that it's just going to take a huge shovel to dig out. There's no piecemeal option right now.
Go big or go home. Gigi, what do you think?
Well, I absolutely, to start from the end, I agree with Katharine. Congress has got to make a big bet. And I've actually, not only on the federal level, but again, they did actually just give up a whole bunch of money to the states. I do think the states and localities know better where the holes are. They're actually building the maps that the federal government hasn't built yet, that determine where you can build broadband and who has it. Critically important, but it's going to take a big bet. And the kind of numbers that President Biden's been talking about, I think, are the kind of numbers that we're going to need. So look, in my perfect world, everyone's connected to a future-proof, fast, and affordable and open internet. Right. So, you know what that means. We cannot make the same mistake that we made the past 10 years. So the FCC and other agencies have spent about $50 billion over the last 10 years trying to build broadband everywhere, and they failed miserably. They invested in slow technologies. They, weren't careful about where they build. So what do we have? We have slow networks. We have still, by one account, 42 million Americans that don't have access to any network at all. So we need to be much, much smarter. It's not only about who gets the money or how much or for what. It's also how it's given out. And that's one of the reasons why I'm favorable towards giving a big chunk to the states, because again, they'll have a better idea of where the need is. And the federal government, unfortunately, last decade has failed miserably in that. So we've got to do a better job of that. Robust competition, both in broadband and platforms. We haven't talked much about the platforms today because this is about net neutrality, but I think we all want that as well. We don't want one social network or one microblogging platform and one e-commerce site. We need more of that, and that's a whole another conversation. But the way you get competition in broadband is you have more open access networks and you have communities building. I mean, that's again allowing communities everywhere to build and convincing them that it's doable. That's not a small thing, because even in the 26 or 27 states where you can build, it's a little disappointing. And part of that is the price tag. People see the price tag of building fiber up front and they freak out. Okay. Now, somebody's got to be telling them over the long term that's going to work out. And by the way, this is where I think the pandemic has made a difference, because in a lot of communities, what's happened is, local philanthropic organizations and the government, cobble together some money and they pay Comcast or they pay AT&T and, or they buy hotspots, and they know that is not going to work. So I think you're going to see more and more communities say, yeah, it's a big ticket item up front, but in the long run, it's going to help. And then, again, this is, the same as robust competition. We've got to get rid of the monopolies and got to get rid of the bottlenecks. I mean, that's, we have to control our own internet experience. We have to be the creators. We have to be the innovators. We can't have somebody else, determining that for us. And I say that goes both for the broadband industry and the platform providers as well. We need more choice, and we need more say, and we need more control.
Well said. So we're going to go ahead and pull some questions from our online audience here. I apologize if I get your username, if I state it wrong, because obviously these are usernames are meant to be kind of fun. So Dr. Cece on Twitch here says, I moved from San Francisco to the Sierra foothills in 2018. The access is poor and very monopolistic. Fiber has started coming down the highway in the next county. Any suggestions about motivating my county politicians to get on building that fiber infrastructure? And I'll ask that to Katharine, because we deal with a lot of this little activism work.
I think Ernesto and I recently did a sort of local virtual town hall on this issue, and someone had advice that I think is really important, which is don't underestimate how far one phone call to your local representative can go. Very few people take the time to reach out. So if you do, or you and some of your friends do, that can move the needle way more than you think it can. You can also, organize and do a whole bunch of other things. Look up a local organization. There are quite a few, especially now. But even just one phone call will move the needle more than you think it will in local access. And if you are here in California, a bunch of changes in state law and a bunch of money has sort of freed up. So you can sort of lobby for that. Another good resource almost always are your local libraries. They are almost always on the forefront of these issues and are very good about it and are really good resources and places to sort of start.
Yeah, and I'll go for it, Gigi.
I just add, what I found when I was at the FCC, I used to, go around the country, making speeches in places where they built these. And I've always found that there was always one person on the county council or the city council who was just so passionate about this, right? Now, if you could find that person, that's great. If that person doesn't exist, you have to create that person. I was just talking to a state legislator in West Virginia who's trying to build an open access network there. And he's like a dog with a bone. I mean, he's just gonna get it done. And it's trying to find those people, particularly now, again, in the aftermath of the pandemic. I think you're going to find more of those folks that really, really, want to build networks, want to take the fiber assets in a community and build something that's lasting and that will, connect the unconnected.
Also, ironically, the further you are from a major market, you might actually find it slightly easier because if they aren't connecting you, they won't see it as a loss in customer base. The way that when San Francisco tried to build a municipal fiber line, there was a lot of resistance to that because no one wants to lose access to selling bad internet to people here.
Well, I'll add one thing. So part of my work is in California. For the Californians watching right now, we actually have, we just published today just to check out the EFF blog, but the state of California and the legislature is making a decision next week on what to do with the state surplus and the federal rescue money. We have about $7 billion that our governor in this state has identified for public infrastructure. We're talking about, the state building out middle mile open access fiber networks to pretty much everyone. And enabling municipalities, cooperatives, nonprofits, all of the alternative models that have been underutilized as solutions, and giving them a whole ton of money to give them a chance. Essentially the Biden plan, is on the verge of being agreed to in California or shelved or postponed. And so, it's really important. Go to the EFF.org. It's our most recent published blog about Sacramento and $7 billion. Because I think if you give communities a budget and an account and an ability to access funding, if they go forth, many will, and it helps them, as Gigi, you said, kind of get over that price tag if they know their support. If they know the fifth largest economy, state government is backing your play, that gives an awful lot of confidence. But we have to get there first. So hopefully next week, EFF will have some good news to report to our constituents, because we're coming around the corner on that. So our next question is from Zeeb Free on Twitch. There's a question I want to pose to you, Gigi. What are the largest issues currently preventing new competitors from competing from the largest providers?
I mean, basically, they can't get I mean, everything. Like here's why. I mean, that is in a lot of ways a hard question to answer. I do think the fact that competitors can't get access to poles, right? So those telephone poles in your neighborhood. This is one of the reasons why Google Fiber failed in a lot of places. That's one, and a lot in some cases those poles are controlled by a city or state. In some cases, they're controlled by the incumbent provider. They can't get into condos and apartment buildings. I think Katharine was mentioning that, right?
Yep.
We call them multi-tenant environments. 30% of Americans live in multi-tenant environments, and they're allowed exclusives. So they cut sweetheart deals. The landlords cut sweetheart deals with the incumbents. So that's another reason. And then again, there's no requirement that incumbents open up their networks like there was pre-2002, as I discussed before. And then again, the barriers to entry for community broadband networks, and also just again the price, right? I mean, and in some cases, a community, look, you need to dig up public roads in order to build these networks, and in a lot of cases, a city is like, nah, we're fine with R1 or R2. So there are an awful lot of barriers that good policy could fix.
So one of the really interesting ones you mentioned there that we have a personal experience with is EFF. We actually do local campaigns around this, is that apartment complex monopoly dynamic. So San Francisco is the first city in the state of California that basically banned, to take a step back for folks to understand, Comcast will enter an agreement with the landlord and landlord association and say, hey, for every customer you could sign up in that building to us, we'll give you a little extra from their broadband bill. And you could see the incentive of like, okay, well, if I get you 100% of the customers, I'll get 100% of the benefit from the the cable payola, as Susan Crawford described in a Wired article. And San Francisco issued a local ordinance. So, regulation doesn't have to happen only from the FCC. There's actually a local play and a state play and a county play and all this. But they basically, the competition policy was landlords are not allowed to prevent competitors from entering apartment buildings absent like a legitimate reason for like health and safety. Because what was happening, as I mentioned earlier, we have the largest competitive fiber provider with Sonic in the area. They couldn't get, they're selling gigabit $40 internet, right? And they can't get to people in attendance because the landlord would say, just get off my lawn. You're not allowed in my building. And so they're exerting this property right as a way to maintain 100% captivity with their agreement with their cable company. So, we've banned that in the city of San Francisco, and we are working on Oakland and Berkeley and we're kind of working our way out from this area. And someday we will get across the whole state, but it's one of those simple things that people may not realize denies, competition, because it's easy to get an apartment building. Lots of people in a very small place, not a lot of money to connect them. But if the landlord says no, then you're out of luck. And go for it, Kathy. Yeah.
I still remember my shock when I moved here from New York, which is where I was before I worked for EFF. And the management, when I moved in, was like, here are all of your options for internet. And like, we like Sonic. You should probably go with them. Many people in the building do. And I was like, I don't understand this. I didn't have this choice before.
Yeah, I know. It's like and this is why, Gigi, you're being at the forefront in the history of this. People, younger than me have no memory, no memory of what the world was and how law and policy actually make a world of difference here. All right, so let's grab another question. I think we got time for probably two more before we have to wrap up. But this one is from a Fred Flintstone on YouTube. Can we reasonably expect government to be a solution to a market failure when regulatory or unregulatory capture of that government is essentially the cause of the market failure? Katharine, I'll pose that question to you.
So I think that that's a fair question, because the longer I work at EFF, the more skeptical I actually get about government when it comes to technology. But at the same time, what caused this problem wasn't even as much of capture as it was not doing anything or having a policy that worked and then rolling it back. I think that's really the thing to point out, is that a lot of, like, as Gigi said, back when the Telecommunications Act required them to give the large companies to give access to competitors, that worked. That's why Sonic exists in San Francisco. And I swear to God, we're not sponsored by Sonic. It's just because it's what's here. It's the most ready example. Like, we know that net neutrality was protected under the Open Internet Order, and the sky didn't fall, and it worked, and it was sustaining something that had existed before. Net neutrality had been just sort of how the internet worked for a long time. They were just protecting that. So I think, and in the case of like the FCC, that wasn't regulatory capture. I think if you think way back when to the first time John Oliver did his episode on net neutrality, he called out Tom Wheeler and called him a coyote that you've put in charge of your
dingo. Yeah, that's right.
In charge of your babies. Like, he and Tom Wheeler was the chair of the FCC who passed net neutrality. You can't necessarily make bets on whether you can or can't trust it, but you can make bets on what we know has worked in the past and why we should do it again.
Gigi, you were there on the team when Tom Wheeler was called a dingo, I believe. What how did the former chairman take that one, and did that have an impact on his overall thinking about how to be the head of the regulatory agency at the time?
I will tell you what did have an impact, and it plays into what Katharine just said. There was a constant drumbeat of regular people calling, emailing. Sometimes we get these like email dumps, like 2,000 emails at 11 o'clock at night, and my chief of staff would call me and say, Gigi, make it stop. Protests in front of the White House, protests laying down in front of my boss's, driveway. So he's like 6'7" and he had a Cooper Mini. Go figure. That should be a car for me, not for him. That pressure worked. It worked not only on my boss, it worked on the White House big time, right? The White House politicos were like, why are we not supporting Title II net neutrality? This is crazy. Everybody wants it, So, you can talk about regulatory capture, with some folks it's true, with some agencies it's true, but nothing beats industry, I would say also in the halls of Congress, more than ordinary people saying, we want this. That's how you get through, and it worked big time, in 2015. And it was a great time to be there, but boy, there were a lot of sleepless nights.
I was a journalist at that time, and I had been assigned by my boss to read through all of the comments being submitted for net neutrality and pull out the best and the funniest. And I distinctly remember opening up a comment that was huge, and someone had submitted the entire script for the Lord of the Rings movies. I was just staring at it like, this can't be helpful.
Well, and what's funny is EFF is one of the drivers of many of the comments, because we do a campaign around it, and net neutrality is definitely the one that through and through people of all walks of life care a whole ton about it. And I remember the idea of common carriage and Title II and all that. There was a time when that was considered absolutely impossible politically, and you fast forward, that was only not that long ago. I mean, I think it was like 7 or 8 years ago, it feels at this point, maybe a little longer than that. But what's the actual votes in Congress show? To Gigi's point, when we had to do the Save the Net Act, Katharine ran this campaign for EFF. We had a bipartisan vote in the United States Senate. We had 3 Republican senators joining with all the Democrats. So
that wasn't Save the Net. That was the CRA. Save the Net was the House.
Oh, right. That's right, because it was that, and then the sequence that followed. But the point being, like, there's a bipartisan majority on one side of this debate, and not and a minority on the other that generally hopes that the people cannot break through at the end of the day. I think we'll take one more question here from the audience before we have to conclude. But we got Kevin M on Twitch. From a fiber perspective, should the fiber 1 and data layer 2 be managed by some type of government or government regulated entity or nonprofit, with the network layer being provided by multiple ISPs similar to the Utopia network? So Utopia is this network in Utah that is a collaborative effort by a bunch of local governments to build what's called an open access fiber network. Or would it be better for government or government regulated entities or nonprofits to manage the entire network from fiber through the network layer? I'll give a quick take on that, and I'll feel free to chime in. But I think the reality is there are going to be different solutions for different communities, and really you just want to empower all the local options, so long as they're building the future. And so long as we need more access tomorrow than the day before in terms of capacity, you want to build something that's meant to last for not just a few years, but for a generation or two. And what's happening in Utah, and this is just one of the most fascinating things about this debate, is Utah is a state of the union, has the most municipal fiber in the country, represented by a very conservative legislature and a very conservative, federal representation. And I think they show, like, when lots of communities band together, you can do these kind of large open scale projects. But I also say on the flip side, small townships and in areas where you have rural cooperatives, you probably are relying on them to build their own and run their own network, and that's fine because they own it. So you're not worried about your neighbor screwing you when you own part of your own network. You charge what you need to charge to make it run efficiently. I love anyone else having to go for it. Go for it.
I was just going to say, like, I think you've got Utopia on one side, and then that's an example for the first one, and for the second one, it's Chattanooga is sort of the example of the other one, where they run everything through one municipally owned service, and they serve different functions in terms of a problem. And I think it's important to note that some of these problems are just different, and there are different answers. I think you're right, Ernesto. In cities, many people might think that they have options or that their internet isn't expensive because they live in the part of the city that hasn't been what's called digitally redlined. Because in an affluent part of the city, many ISPs are trying to get there because they want your money, but they might not get service. So that's a different problem from in rural areas, where part of the problem is access, period. And that they just need to build it, and they're building fiber because they have to, because no one else is. And so different kinds of problems are going to have different solutions.
I think actually the reason that Utopia is an open access network is because Utah law prohibits the community from providing last mile service. So it's interesting. It's a very pro-competitive way to get around a restriction. And I think that's a restriction in a bunch of states. So if they just want to build open access networks to get around that restriction, I'm down. that. But again, like Chattanooga already had a municipal utility, so it wasn't that hard for them to kind of take it to the next step. I'm with you, Ernie. It's like different strokes and different business models for different communities, but communities should be empowered to make that decision rather than have, the state legislature tie their hands.
So with that, I'm going to bring us to a conclusion. We're at the top of the hour. First, thank you, Katharine, and thank you, Gigi, for joining us today. I also want to thank all the folks that have tuned in and have contributed to this discussion. Everyone around the world here watching. We can't do this work without your support. And so for over 30 years, EFF has stood alongside you on the front lines of the movement for privacy, free expression, innovation online, and we always need your help to keep up the fight. So if you haven't yet, I ask you humbly to consider donating to EFF today, becoming a member. You can go to EFF.org/30 because your support is the reason why Katharine and I can do the work we do on your behalf. We do work for you in that sense. And so that's all the time we have for today. I hope you'll continue these conversations and consider how we can ensure technology supports freedom, justice, innovation, and equity for all people around the world. And thank you again for coming, and see you at our next live stream. Have a great night.